Alright, once again another deck profile, this time on a deck that I haven't even profiled on ever since it was introduced because I felt like it wasn't enough support, and once again, just like every introduction of the deck, every deck was going to look the same, but over time the deck technically got more support, although not direct support, more so indirect support, and also recently with Lyrical Set 2 we actually got some direct support for the deck that I actually felt like the deck has enough changes to make me actually do a profile now. Especially since I do build it in a way where it's a little different than many other people, and I'll explain why. But this was a Bermuda Triangle deck originally, back all the way from the beginning, and I have never built this deck before. And D-Series completely changed its playstyle where it gets its power completely based on the number of forms you have from its soul. And that's one thing I do find unique. And in combination of that, because of getting those power from those forms of herself, her other forms of herself, the smaller ones, actually give her some extra skills, which I also find a little bit unique about this deck that I actually kind of end up liking the deck, especially with the design. Although unfortunately, the deck still feels a bit incomplete even though it doesn't really have that much issue. It was pretty decent on its release, but I felt like they put too much recycling in this deck rather than basically search power. But luckily we do have an indirect support that actually gave us search power, so the deck is still pretty decent because of it, but I really hope that we do get some direct support that actually give us some search power, because there's a lot of recycling in this deck more than search power, and I feel like that is something that is pretty lacking. And hopefully this one will also get its evolved form eventually, because it's already been a year or two since this card was released and still no evolved form. And we did get an encounter generic that doesn't really work well with this deck, because this deck does suffer the problem of needing energy and also needing to keep its soul, that the encounter generic is not even good for the deck. But overall, the deck is still pretty good. It doesn't play like typical Lyrical where you're going to be balancing your rear guards, since it's actually more so make a board and then power up your board type deck. So it doesn't play typical Lyrical, which is something I also kind of like. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Ride deck. So we start off with the starter, Angelic Star Coral, which you do have to play just for the name, in which we go to the grade 1 Fresh Star Coral. So when the grade 2 rides on top of it, Shining Star Coral, look at top 7 cards of your deck for 1 coral from among them or 1 grade 3 from among them and put to your hand. So this is pretty nice that you could search for either a Persona ride or another copy of Coral, which is going to be very important for the deck just because all the ride line corals are going to have another skill, which is their second skill, where in this case, when put to soul by a card ability of your at least grade 3 coral, that's going to be the playstyle. Put it to soul, so you give it an ability. In this case, you give your Vanguard plus 5k power, and if your opponent's Vanguard is at least grade 3, triple drive. And yes, it's a triple drive ability, not drive plus 1. So your opponent can end up using a Sanctity 2 for free. But yeah, this is one of those rare ride lines where you actually have to play multiple copies of just because it has an additional skill that actually helps out the deck. In which we go to the Shining Star Coral, so when this card attacks, you can bounce back one of your rear guards back to hand. This skill is not completely relevant, but then it does give you some early game attacks, so that is pretty nice. And in a way, it does let you reuse on-place abilities. In which the second skill is that when it gets sucked to soul by your at least grade 3 Vanguard Coral, you can energy charge 1, draw a card, and choose one of your rear guards and it gets plus 5k. So the grade 1 gives your Vanguard power, the grade 2 gives your rear guard power. The grade 2 can be used at any turn, even if you go first or second, it gives you draw power, although the grade 1 is definitely better because of the triple drive. But this card does get important sometimes, especially if you went first, because this does energy charge and that does add up. Because due to the fact that Coral in a way it has some similarities with Leo Draconis, where it needs to energy blast 4 and you only get 3 energy per turn, so you have to keep up with that 1 extra energy. So just keep that one in mind. In which we go to the Aurora Star Coral, which has a skill where all your coral units get plus 5k shield, hence why there's a bit of recycling, and I kinda like that in a way because it gives some extra shield to some of your key units, but then it does make you have to put the choice of whether it's worth using them as extra shield or putting them as soul for this card, because of the next skill where at Vanguard once per turn, put a card from your hand to soul, and then draw a card, and then if you put a coral as a cost, this card gets this ability until the end turn. When this card attacks, choose one of your rear guards and stand it. So by default, you get 4 attacks. Yes, it is pretty nice that you can suck 1 card to draw 1 card, meaning that you get 1 extra soul, but even better when you put a coral in, because coral will give it the extra ability to restand, and because you're putting a coral in, the Coral actually has an extra skill like you saw in the ride line, so you get additional ability on top of it. But the energy usage ability is the next skill where, at the beginning of your battle phase, Energy Blast 4, and then until the end of turn, all your front row units gets plus 5 key power for every 2 Corals in Soul. So by the time you hit grade 3, that's already 3 Corals in Soul because of your ride line. And then when you suck one in from the first skill, that's 4. So that's actually 10k power on your first grade 3 ride. And then if your opponent's Vanguard is at least grade 3, crit plus 1 into the end turn as well. So Energy Blast 4 to power up your whole front board, which you do have to be careful of because you can run out of energy because of Energy Blast 4. You get 3, so meaning that you're kind of minusing 1 energy per turn, hence why the grade 2 kind of comes in. But still pretty good. It gives you 1 additional attack, so it's a 4 attack deck, no 5 attacks yet. Powers up your whole front board, which could actually end up being bigger over time, because on Persona Ride turn, you'll have a 5th one, and then use its skill again for a 6th one, so over time you'll probably get maybe 2 extra Corals in Soul. And this one also has crit pressure, and it's also very nice that the Corals get extra 5k shield, and including herself, which will become a 5k shield because she's a grade 3, that still can be counted as Guardian. But yeah, overall, it's a pretty nice card, although still hoping for evolve forms eventually, since encounters tend to have their evolve forms. And doesn't play your typical lyrical way because this one actually wants you to power up your board, and this is what I also mean that you don't really want to be soul blasting, because soul blasting also means less power. Although with all the recycling cards, soul blasting is not entirely too bad, especially to reuse your key pieces of your grade 1 and 2 Corals. In which we continue off to 3 more for Persona Ride, because of course Persona Ride. And then to a Coral support, which is Luminous Melody, whatever name that I can't pronounce. So this one on attack, while you have at least 4 Corals in Soul, so meaning you do have to put that Coral in your Soul for the first ability, you can counterblast 1 to draw a card and give it plus 5k power in your end turn. And keep in mind this is not once per turn, so you could actually play this skill twice, although just be careful with the counterblast with this deck because it does actually add up. Although luckily counterblast is not too important for the deck since your key cards don't really entirely need counterblasts, but just do be aware of the counterblast usage. In which the second skill where at the end of turn, while you have at least 4 Corals in Soul, you can Soul Blast 1 to return it back to the hand. Most of the time you're not really going to use this skill because 1, it costs a Soul Blast, which means that you're losing a Coral in Soul, and 2, you're bouncing back a grade 3. So there's really no point of bouncing this back, especially when it doesn't have an on-place ability. But it can be a nice beater with some extra draw power, hence why I still run 2 copies of it. But I will have to say there are technically better stuff to run than this, but at the moment, for Coral, this is still pretty decent, especially for big beater reasons, so that's why I decided to run. In which, like I said from the ride line, you had to run more copies of the Coral, so 3 more copies of the grade 2 Coral. And then some old original Coral cards. So first off with the Retailer. So this one, when placed on rearguard, you can counterblast 1 to choose a Coral from a drop zone to put it back to hand. And this is what I mean about the recycling. There's actually quite a decent amount of these. In which the second skill is that while you have at least 4 Corals in Soul, it gets plus 5 key power and 5 key shield active on your opponent's turn as well. And once again, you need the 4 Corals, which is doable on your first grade 3 ride. That's why keep in mind about the Soul Blast. But it could be a nice beater plus extra defensive and also recycling. But here's another counterblast for recycling, so just do be careful of it. To a new support, Embelio. This one, when your Coral is put to Soul by a card ability, you can counterblast 1 to call this back to rearguard, and if your opponent's Vanguard is at least grade 3 plus 10k. I never suffer board problems with this deck, but it is nice that you can call this back from the drop zone just in case you need it, especially as discard fodder, and it could be a big beater, or in my case, it'll be used for another reason. But I never really suffer board problems with this deck, so it's not the most necessary card, but it is pretty useful. With the second skill where at the end of the battle discard tech, if you have a Vanguard Coral, you can put this to the bottom deck to draw a card. It would be nice if this card can put itself to Soul so you could Soul Blast it back out, because you do have some Soul Blast abilities, but extra draw power is pretty nice, but I actually don't really use that skill too often because I do like to keep this at the drop zone. But a Resurrection type card is always pretty nice, even though this Resurrection does add up the counterblast, unfortunately. And then one card that is not Coral direct support, but more so indirect, is the Apollini. This is actually a Kairi card, but only the second skill is actually Kairi related, because the first skill is actually when placed on rearguard, you can reveal at least a grade 3 mermaid from your ride deck. And if either that or your Vanguard is at least a grade 3 mermaid, you can counterblast 1 to look at top 5 cards of your deck to choose up to 1 mermaid from among them and put to your hand. Yes, you search for a mermaid. not for Kairi or anything. This is a Kairi card. Nothing related to Kairi. It's mermaids. So yeah, the fact that it just needs the grade 3 mermaid just makes this card very good. And it actually gives out searching for the deck that it actually needs. Because sometimes you do need those corals in your hand, and those corals are all mermaids. So it actually gives out one of the best searches for the deck that you just have to run 4 of these, even if it does cost you a counterblast, but this is probably the most important counterblast that you're going to use. So yeah, 4 of these it is. Although I do hope that there's a direct support version in the future. And finally, this is my personal tech option, but I do run the hostage cards. And the lyrical hostage actually gives out boosting to your rear guards. And the reason why I like to run hostage for this deck is the amount of grade 2s you actually run for the deck. You got a superior caller from the drop zone that gives you plus 10k power on the turn you resurrect it, which could be a 20k boost. And even if it's not a 20k boost, you still also have a bunch of grade 2s, which will still be 10k boosters, which does change up magic numbers. And that's why I decided to run the hostage stuff in this deck, just because you do run not too many grade 1s, but you run a good number of grade 2s, so it actually adds some extra big boosters, so that's why I kind of just like it. And now to the grade 1 lineup. So just like I said from Ride Line, you have to run more copies of the Coral. And then to a original support as well, it is Ruika. So Ruika, when this card boosts while your Vanguard is Coral, you can choose a Coral from your drop zone and put it to Soul. And if you do not countercharge during the turn, at the end of the battle this card boosts, you can retire this unit to countercharge 1. So it's a countercharger if you need it. For this deck, the counterblast is starting to add up, although it's not to the point where you run out very quickly. But sometimes the countercharge is very helpful, so of course you just run it for the countercharging. And sometimes you end up putting those cores in the drop zone that you could actually just put them to Soul just to add more power. So there is that as well, but it's more so here for countercharging. And here's what I mean once again, just more recycling of corals, which I really wish there's more searching of. In which finally to Uika, because there's not that much other better stuff to run. And bouncing can always be pretty helpful for this deck, even if you must Soul Blast a coral. But you don't want to be Soul Blasting it early, because if you Soul Blast the corals early, you're going to be losing out on the 4 corals part. But it is very helpful to bounce back those cards that actually have some on-place abilities, so there is that as well. And then finally to the last regular unit, I run the 1 extra copy of the grade 0 coral, because this actually has come up a few times where you actually need that 1 extra copy of coral to get your extra bonus ability, even though this is a vanilla. So once again, I do hope for another coral in the future, even if it's a new form of a grade 3, and maybe superior rider from Soul just to make it pretty awesome. And then finally, 4 PGs, because PGs, and I chose the encounter one. And future reference, there might be some Bermuda Triangle searching, so that might be also very important. And into the trigger lineup, OT, choose whatever you want. 8 crits, of course, to kill your opponent as soon as possible. 3 draws to see your pieces, and if you don't run draws in this deck, your hand power can actually be lacking. But if you do run draws in this deck, you could actually end up having a lot of cards in hand. Because it's actually kind of weird how this deck functions sometimes. Especially when you draw your key pieces, you actually get those extra pluses. But if you don't draw your key pieces, you don't get those pluses. So it's kind of funny with this deck. And finally, 4 heals, 2 being counters. And so that's it for this deck profile on my Coral deck. What do you guys think of it? What other cards would you recommend? And what other changes would you make? Honestly, Coral as it is right now is pretty fun, although still suffers from the problem of probably not the direct support of searching, which a Kairi card actually had to help us out with that. Which is very surprising to me that it actually is just Mermaid locked rather than Kairi locked. But with the new support of Coral, the deck still kind of functions exactly the same as it originally was introduced, with just some added consistency of adding up your board, even though this deck never really suffered too much from board problems. But when it does suffer from board problems, you do at least have some pretty good new support that actually helps you out. And there are other additional new cards that Coral did get, but they were just very iffy that it didn't really matter to put them in. Some of them are alternate backups to Suck in Soul, even though you never really had a problem to put regular corals into Soul. Especially if you're forced to use them as discard or guard fodder, you have ways to recycle them anyway. And I have to say, this deck was introduced with too much recycling and just not enough searching. But still overall a fun deck that I originally was not going to build, and I originally did not even build from the original format, but kind of end up building now since the playstyle did play a bit different from the original and it's not typical lyrical. And I do find its design gorgeous, especially in a way it does remind me a bit of Chris Rain, that I end up just wanting to build this deck, especially having a lyrical encounter deck, because I kind of want one for every nation, and this is my only lyrical encounter deck, and this is the one I kind of end up liking. But other than that, if you also really want a budget deck that is also waifu, technically this is a very budget-friendly deck. You just have to take out Yuika, and Yuika is not completely necessary for the deck, so there are other options as well. The only one that you kind of have to watch out for is this one, because this grade 2 that is for Kairi is generic for any mermaid deck, so that is the one that you just have to watch out for. But other than that, the deck is still pretty cheap to build, so if you like mermaids and you want something maybe encounter or just something very cheap that is still pretty fun, I could recommend this deck. But other than that, that's it for this, and see you next time.